Okay, looks like we're doing pretty well. Hey, everybody. I hope your Monday afternoon is going well so far. We're going to start, while we wait for a few more people to join, we're going to launch our first poll as a sort of interactive, fun thing to start with. So hopefully you can all see that coming up now. So while you get going, while you get settled, take a minute and answer this poll question. And while you're all doing that, I'll do a quick overview and an introduction to the session. So first of all, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for being here. We're very excited. This session will be on advancing clean mobility for all, and it's sponsored by Oracle. We have 5 great speakers today, and we'll have 5 great talks. And throughout the session, we'll have a series of little mini poll questions, just like this one. So we'll be able to sort of flip back and forth between those, and hopefully it'll make it reasonably interactive. We have an hour and 15 minutes as a whole. And so the talks will take up about sort of 50 minutes, maybe as much as an hour of this session. And then we'll have a full group Q&A at the end. We're going to see at the end if we can get the technology to work such that people can raise their hands and ask questions in quite an interactive way. So do hold questions, think of them as they come along, and we'll get them all moving at the end. And with that, I think I might start by picking apart this poll. So any more poll questions, please answer. We have 29 out of 35 people, 30 out of 35, that's great. And it seems so far, so the question for those who aren't able to read or can't see it is, what is your interest in transportation? Select all that apply. The winning answer so far is people who are researchers or academics looking to learn. We also have quite a few people from government looking to apply. We have students looking to learn. We have a handful of planners or professionals looking to apply. We have a few from the third sector, and we have a few other. It's a really interesting split. Thank you, everybody. Okay, seems like we have everyone in, and everyone's sort of got set and got their interactive bit out of the way. I'm going to start now then by introducing our first speaker. So our first speaker today is Eli Alston-Stepnitz. He's a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Davis. He's currently working on several projects relating to electrification, including ones that focus on micromobility, alternative fuel vehicles, medium and heavy fleet vehicles, commercial and resident technologies, and affordable housing. Welcome, Eli, and I'll hand over to you now to start your talk.
Great, thanks. Let me just share my screen here. Can everybody see the screen? Yep, no. Great. Okay, so this is a lightning session, so I'm gonna go a bit quick on this. So my name is Eli. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis, where I work with Dr. Angela Sanguinetti, who is the PI on the project that I'm talking about today. So shared micromobility. So advances in light electric vehicle technology, along with the phenomenon of shared mobility, have led to the emergence of shared micromobility services, which include on-demand docked or dockless electric or traditional human-powered bikes, scooters, and mopeds. And shared micromobility is being widely promoted for its social and environmental benefits, like increased mobility, providing options for first and last mile connections with public transit or other shared modes, filling mobility access gaps in underserved communities. And shared micromobility modes, to varying degrees, are still more environmentally friendly and more active than personal car travel. Shared micromobility is accessible to more people who would not be able to bike or walk to their destinations, thus offering more mobility options to expand the health benefits of active travel to more people. And it also offers a safer alternative to sharing a vehicle with people outside of one's household, limiting the prospect of COVID transmission. So we know that there's a lot of promise of micromobility, but of course there are still some barriers. In particular, safer streets are a precursor to fulfill potential adoption and benefits of micromobility. So the emergence of shared micromobility and the uptick in active modes generally during the pandemic has drawn a lot of attention to a widespread deficit of safe and appropriate infrastructure for all types of transportation. So some of these issues include a lack of bike lanes or sidewalks, or a need for improvements on those things because the bike lanes are either unprotected or unconnected, and that can leave users with a partially unsafe route or a longer route than necessary. And then there's also often a lack of clear regulation or guidance as to where to ride and park the vehicles, and a lack of equitable access to these services. And then alongside the emergence of shared mobility in general is this growing wealth of mobility data generated by operators who provide the services. And so these data, which include mode use, traffic volumes, origins and destinations, and routes, they can support public agencies in regulating mobility companies and planning for changing transportation patterns and needs. However, analyzing the data requires sophisticated technical skills. And so this has created a market for software platforms that can kind of help this process, help people evaluate the data. But these advanced planning tools can be really expensive, prohibitively expensive for the public sector, and they're not even always available for cities, much less for nonprofit advocacy groups who are often some of the strongest voices for these progressive micromobility infrastructures and policies. And so advocacy orgs fight for safer streets for micromobility, but they often lack the resources to gather this rigorous data. And so they typically rely on kind of anecdotal data, which doesn't really carry the weight needed to drive this government decision making. So enter MDSS. So realizing the potential value of mobility data tools in the hands of those who are working hardest to make streets safer for micromobility, Spin launched a program called Mobility Data for Safer Streets. And so this inaugural pilot phase of the project awarded 6 different advocates around the country with access to a suite of data tools to leverage in their advocacy for safer streets. And so the awardees were Bike Cleveland, Bike Utah, Walk Bike Nashville, Denver Streets Partnership, Bike Walk North Carolina, and Sustain Charlotte. And the tools package included 5 software-based tools. And so those were Streetlight Data, Urban Footprint, Populous, Strava Metro, and Gale. And so these tools are really diverse, and they provide a lot of data on various modes and a rich array of travel data metrics, and then opportunities to use these data and make data visualizations. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I just kind of want to get to the interesting results. Also noting that the awardees were given several physical data gathering tools. So they were given a professional grade radar speed gun, a bike pedestrian count sensor, and a time-lapse time-lapse camera. And so Spin and Ford enlisted us, UC Davis, to evaluate the program. And in effect, we were able to develop a multiple case study research design aimed at generating best practices for the use of mobility data to advocate for safer streets. Our methods really centered on quarterly interviews with each awardee. I'm happy again to talk more about our methods in the Q&A. We had several different research aims. And then in our analyses, we took several lenses to try to understand the best practices for the use of mobility data for safer streets advocacy, including looking for themes in the use of data to support different types of street redesign interventions, as well as identifying several broad contextual themes, looking across all the works that the organizations did with the data tools. And this included working with local government, garnering community support, supporting underrepresented communities, and advocating for safer streets for all. And so I'm going to highlight a few projects. This first project I'm highlighting was an analysis done by Bike Utah. And so city engineers there had the impression that buffered bike lanes were not being used appropriately. So Bike Utah set up this time-lapse camera at various locations and then put together videos like the one that you're seeing right now. And these showed that virtually all users were using the bike lanes appropriately. And the outcome was that the city recommitted to continuing to build buffered bike lanes. And our contact at Bike Utah described the importance of the buffered bike lanes and this project, saying that buffered bike lanes are like the gateway drug to more protective bike lanes. So convincing the city engineers not to discontinue building them was really, really important for these longer term goals of even safer facilities. This next analysis was by Bike Cleveland, and it was part of a larger project that was advocating for a road diet on a large arterial road. So current facilities are unsafe, and to demonstrate that users felt unsafe in the bike lane, they used Strava Metro to look at the precise routes taken by cyclists on this road. And they found that bikers were traveling actually on the sidewalk, which is technically illegal, instead of the bike lane because they didn't feel safe in the bike lane. They were also able to use traffic volume data from streetlight to show that bike volumes were high and that car volumes were not as high as they expected. And this helped them make the case that the road diet was desperately needed and it wouldn't actually adversely affect car traffic. Our contact at Bike Cleveland explained how it's really important to frame these kinds of interventions as improving safety for all users. And then two awardee organizations, Walk Bike Nashville and Denver Streets Partnership, use data to support slow streets programs in their cities, sometimes also called shared streets. You're probably familiar with those. So these have been implemented in many cities all over the world during the pandemic and involve closing off parts of a street to through traffic to make them more safe for active modes. And so Denver Streets Partnership used the eco counter, installing it at different slow streets locations throughout the city to document bike, scooter, and pedestrian counts compared to the data that they had collected a prior year before the pandemic. And so this really demonstrated that the intervention was supporting and encouraging active travel and new users to active travel. And then Walk Bike Nashville, used streetlight data to also analyze the car volumes, speeds, and cut through before and after the slow streets installations, also showing their success in Nashville. Our Denver contact described how the city has had a wealth of data on car traffic and road conditions that affect cars, like potholes, but that they don't really have data on active modes. So even very basic bike ped counts from the eco counter were actually extremely valuable. The city really relied on her organization to collect the data to evaluate these slow streets programs. And so this dynamic kind of created a collaboration, and the city was really appreciative of the data that they had to offer. And then several different projects also use tools related to supporting underrepresented communities. So several different organizations were concerned with the fact that low-income communities in their cities did not have sufficient safe facilities for active transportation, even though those communities are typically more reliant on active transportation. So Bike Utah found that bike volumes are higher in lower income neighborhoods. And then Walk Bike Nashville found that pedestrian fatalities were much higher in lower income neighborhoods. And so a majority of the awardees pointed out that there were some faulty assumptions or weaknesses in the approaches of the city or the planners that resulted in overlooking underrepresented communities, either because the available data or the most vocal community members did not represent these groups. And so the data tools provided those missing data and helped highlight inequalities and the needs of low-income communities. And other awardees remarked that with some of the data tools, they were able to overcome some of those social, economic, and geographic barriers. So that's it. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. And if you have any other questions you want to reach out, there's my contact and there's Angela's contact. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eli. Excellent, great first talk. Let's keep rolling through. So, and if you do have questions, do post them in the chat as we go through, and or if you'd like to sort of spark some discussion around them, save them for the end, and we'll have that group discussion as we mentioned. Okay, so our next speaker is Kimberly Jaeger Johnson. But before we get going, we are actually going to run a quick little poll. So I'm going to launch this poll now, coming in 3, 2, 1. Hopefully you can all see that. So take a minute to read through this and answer. We'll just go quiet for a minute and then let's pick apart the results. And then I'll hand over to Kimberly. So everyone take a crack at the poll. Getting there, we've got about 40 out of 51 participants. Thank you, everybody. Last few coming in, and I'll share the results. Give you another sort of 20 seconds. All right, I think that's probably about as many as we're going to get. So I'll end the poll and share the results. So hopefully, as you can see here up on the screen, we have, the question is, what fears do you have around adopting electric vehicles? Select all that apply. The top is there will be an upfront expensive cost, with about 63% of you, or of those who answered saying that. Next, we have you will get stranded without gas. We then have other, I imagine that is the I already have it button, or perhaps some of those at least are I already have it, maybe optimistic. Next is your electric bill will go up, and then very few people, actually nobody, said it won't be safe. Very interesting. So hopefully, Kimberly, you can help us pick apart and understand these. So now I'll hand over to Kimberly. Kimberly is a managing consultant with ILLUME Advising. She was a project manager for ILLUME's 2020 stakeholder engagement work, supporting Arizona utilities in development of a statewide transportation electrification plan. Kimberly, take us away.
Great. Thank you, Joey. All right. My talk will focus on equity in transportation planning. And today, my hope is that you will walk away with ideas for resources that you can use in your own equitable TE planning, transportation electrification process, a list of lessons learned on equitable stakeholder engagement and empowerment, and access to a report on barriers and opportunities for equitable planning, a report developed by stakeholders themselves. So what is transportation electrification? Why is equity in TE important? Plainly put, TE is a process of replacing technologies that use fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, with technologies that use electricity. You can think of electric vehicles, scooters, bus and shipping fleets. It includes charging stations at home, work, multifamily buildings, off the highway, and the infrastructure needed to make it all easy and affordable. So planners grapple with equitable access to TE for a few reasons. There's the price of EVs. The batteries especially can be very expensive, although costs will likely decrease in the coming years. The location of charging stations is a big factor for equity, or rather it's the lack of stations in low to moderate income neighborhoods or BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There tend to be fewer charging stations in these areas, which links to fewer zero-emission vehicles there, which links to less clean air to breathe, which then links to higher health risks for these marginalized communities. There is range anxiety. Many of you mentioned that in the comments. And to clarify what that is, consumers think about charging, or can think about charging, like they think about filling a gas tank and worry they'll get stuck somewhere without power. There's the costs of charging even. So Arizona planners understood this and made equity a priority in their planning process. There we go. So the Arizona utilities put forth a community forward approach to TE, planning to hold space for significant stakeholder engagement before a plan was filed. What you might more commonly see is that stakeholders become invited to comment on a plan after it's already been filed with the commission. In that case, stakeholders or community members who may not typically monitor commission filings or know when or how or if they should provide comments on filed documents could amplify their voice without navigating a formal regulatory process. Arizona aimed for diversity among their stakeholder group. We have participation from EV manufacturers and charging vendors to advocacy organizations, public transit officials in towns and cities, Native American nations were at the table. By design, this approach led planners to develop and ultimately file a more inclusive plan that considered the needs, barriers, and impacts these stakeholders identified. And what's more, this set the stage for stakeholder buy-in. Those of you more familiar with behavior change strategies probably understand the value of stakeholder buy-in and the ripple effect it can have on the success of any initiative. We had 200 or so actively engaged stakeholders sitting around the table from the beginning, investing their own time and expertise for about 6 months. after that level of effort, they were more likely to feel heard and included. They'd be more likely to support the plan and more likely to be willing to do their share, because after all, utilities can't do it all. All in all, it was a very intentional stakeholder engagement effort on a scale with that many folks around the table that we'd not seen before in Arizona, and maybe even in other states, at least within the energy industry. So let's take a look at how we got there. Stakeholders opted into working groups. So each working group focused on 5 key elements of TE planning. Equity was one, along with EV infrastructure, programs and partnerships, goods movement and transit, and vehicle to grid integration. Each working group conducted research and authored a report on key considerations for the statewide plan. And that does include identification and prioritization of those barriers and opportunities to address them. The objective of the equity working group was to explore how EV policies and programs could grow access to TE among marginalized communities. I will note here that these group reports did influence the filed plan and the plan recommendations. And if you're interested in finding them, they're in the appendix of the plan that was filed with the ACC in April 2021. And I do provide a link to that in my slide deck, which hopefully you'll get access to after the presentation. So these next few slides give lessons learned and questions to help think through equitable engagement, empowerment. And for context, just keep in mind that we were expecting to do this entire process in person, but had to quickly pivot to online only engagement because of COVID-19. So that meant ensuring that we had the right tools and support for stakeholders, and also staying cognizant of the day-to-day difficulties and disruptions people were dealing with. So equitable stakeholder engagement, I'm going to move through this a little bit more quickly, but these first 2 points: take the time to plan for and implement an inclusive stakeholder recruitment process. The voices of those who work with, of those who this work will impact, are key at the planning stage to ensure design and implementation are equitable. It takes time to develop an outreach plan. Weeks or months could be spent on this. We worked with Arizona utilities and additionally searched for community groups to invite to the process. We built that list of about 500 stakeholders to recruit. And even so, those who ended up being actively engaged were more of the players you'd expect to see rather than underserved communities. So one of the equity group's very first actions was to look around the table and acknowledge who wasn't there. They made a best effort to recruit others to their working group. For example, they started with 14 members, and after their efforts, it grew to 64 people around the table. When representation is not achieved, be sure to document potential limitations of outreach efforts. For example, the equity group identified that all meetings were held online during normal business hours, exclusively in English. You needed internet access, an email address, and it also assumed that everybody around the table already had some knowledge or education about what TE was. So you can imagine those created barriers in and of themselves. A few others: be sure to elevate the voices of typically underserved stakeholders. And for time, I will keep going forward. Just to let you know, if you can access these slides after the conference, perhaps, I did include some links to the stakeholder engagement framework and other digital tools that we use to conduct this online. And then, as I said earlier, you'll have access to the report. And I also include in the appendix the list of the actual barriers and opportunities the equity group identified. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kimberly. Excellent second talk. Alrighty, so we have another poll before our next one. We're really hitting you with the polls today. This is the last one, I promise. So I'm gonna launch this one, and it'll have so you should see it on your screen now. It has a couple of questions for you to think through. And while you get stuck in and read through and answer that. I've got a quick message from the sponsors. So this session is sponsored by Oracle. I'm going to have a quick message. So decarbonization without electrification isn't possible. Oracle works with utilities to influence the adoption and optimization of electrical vehicles. Learn more at oracle.com/utilities. So thank you, Oracle, and thank you all for getting stuck into this poll. We've got 29 out of 55 so far, 32 out of 55. So give this another 20 or so seconds. If you haven't had an answer yet, please do get stuck in. We are just about at 40 out of 55. Let's see if we can get to 45 people at least. Still coming in. Okay, team, I might pull it there and present the results back. Okay, hopefully you can see these. So the question here is, what transport options are you currently undertaking / seriously considering in the transition to low carbon transport? And we have top answer is the first answer. So about 67% of you are saying traveling shorter distances or traveling less often. You're walking from home. It's a great one. Next highest there is 60% saying getting an electric vehicle, perhaps all primed by the previous talks. Then we have 53% saying walking as a mode of transport for shorter trips, 44 taking public transport more often, 42 getting an e-bike or cycling more, and only 2% are saying none of the above. So very, very promising. Thank you all very much for taking part in that. And next, I'm going to hand over to Vera O'Riordan, who is a PhD student at Marine and Renewable Energy Institute at the University College Cork in Ireland. Her work is funded by the Irish Department of Climate Action, centres on the pathways to low carbon passenger transport in Ireland, with a particular focus on transportation demand reduction and modal shifting measures in helping Ireland achieve its ambitious passenger transportation emissions reductions by 2030. So welcome, Vera, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. So hopefully you will all be able to see that there for a second, and I'll kick off with the presentation here. So yes. Okay, so I was heartened to see from the poll that the most popular response was to reduce the need for transport, because as we're going to jump into here, demand reduction is going to be really, really important for achieving our ambitious climate action targets. And that means really reducing and really reflecting on why do we travel, and targeting reducing the need for such transport demand. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about really going beyond cars and looking into modal shift alongside demand reduction and the electrification of cars. And so just a little top level view of my own research. So what we do is we are based here in Ireland, and we work with policy in Ireland, such as the Climate Action Plan and the Programme for Government. And we use this. They have very ambitious targets. As you can see here, we've set one of the most ambitious targets for a legal obligation for 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this is about 7% per year in greenhouse gas emissions per year reduction year after year. And so at the moment, we're suggesting that perhaps between this would translate to about a 51% reduction for passenger transport, okay? And really, this comes from the broader policy context that so 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transport, half of that is passenger transport. And what we do is, us modelers here on the right, we actually work with policymakers, and we look at their policy documents that reflect the needs of the public, look at emission targets and modeling blind spots. And what we do is we develop modeling tools, analytical capacity then to draw up carbon budgets, say, okay, are we going to achieve these targets? How many tons of CO2 are we looking at here? And what the different targets from a national level would mean for carbon dioxide emissions. So the main framework that we have started to incorporate into our transport models, and this is the one developed by the IPCC, which is responsible for developing the reports on climate action as well, is that they recommend this avoid, shift, improve framework, where first we prioritize avoiding and reducing the need for travel. So great response there on the poll about really thinking about shortening and reducing your need for travel in the first place. And then once you do that, then you look at shifting the remaining journeys to sustainable modes. And then as a final strategy, only as a final strategy, we look at improving the efficiency of the modes that we use. So electrification of bus and rail, looking at electrification then of cars as a last resort, okay? And as well, biofuels do come into it. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So what we know about the status quo here, and so this runs from 2009 to 2020. So what we can see here from the passenger kilometres is private car is the most common transport in Ireland. And then you have your public transport modes and you're walking and cycling at only 1% of passenger kilometres. Compare that to the Netherlands. They have 10% of passenger kilometres. And I know in Ireland here, we use the argument, oh, you know, it's not as flat as the Netherlands, but with technology such as e-bikes coming onto the scene, that is going to be a complete game changer. And it's something that I really want to be able to incorporate into our models here in Ireland for our low carbon passenger transport transition. So we know 82% of the passenger kilometres in Ireland is travelled by private car. And this really needs to be reduced big time if we're serious about meeting our 51% target. And another really important thing to look at when we're trying to decide on policy on how to reduce our need for travel is to understand, well, why is it we're traveling in the first place? And one of the most interesting things we saw really was that work is a pretty popular reason, and so is shopping, and so is, you know, giving people actually a helpful spin, because a spin in Ireland is a colloquial term for giving someone a lift in your car, if that's the correct expression, because they can't make the journey on their own. And that again highlights another issue that comes up with intense car dependency. There are so many people who cannot drive. So we really need to start thinking about transport for people who cannot drive and make it okay for them to get around on their own without relying on car drivers, and also in a sustainable way too, so that then they can walk and cycle or hop on public transport. And then these companion escort journeys are really a way of measuring people's dependency on others for transport. And, you know, I think that is a really important issue in relation to climate justice and transport justice in general. And I'd really like to emphasize that. So now something that I think comes up as well is looking at occupancy rates. How many people are traveling around in our journeys, right? And this actually feeds into the efficiency of transport modes. So we start off with rail up at the left here, and then we continue on down to car transport. And of course, walking and cycling has low occupancy with no emissions associated with it. And I'll show you that next. So emissions per passenger kilometre in Ireland is really important to look at when we're doing our modelling. And you can see, of course, car transport is up at the highest emitting. We have ambitious targets for electrification of vehicles, but at the same time, it's really important to know when we look at our car stock in Ireland, our entire car fleet, the average age of a car in Ireland is about 6 to 7 years old. So we're not going to have all of our 2 million cars as electric vehicles tomorrow, right? And really, you know, it's going to be the next 10 years where this transition, this radical shift in our emissions from passenger transport needs to happen. And we are not going to get, like, we're not even going to get half of our car fleet as electric vehicles by 2030. We've set a target of about 1 million EV vehicles, which is pretty ambitious. And we could possibly achieve that, right? But it's only part of the parcel. of what we need to do. We need to reduce our need for car journeys overall, really look at reducing car ownership in general, because that is one of the biggest predictors of car use. And also then look at how can we improve the situation for people in terms of modal shift and walking and cycling, because you can see here the benefits already, even without having to completely rehash and ditch half of our 2 million cars. Irish Rail, our bus services, our light rail services, walking and cycling have far less emissions per passenger kilometre. And so this was a piece of analysis that we did as part of the Marine and Renewable Energy Institute, which I'm a part of. We looked at our emissions and our pathways to achieving our at least 51% reduction target by 2030 versus 2018. So if I start here on the left, right, we start here, we're talking passenger transport emissions in Ireland. We're talking between 6 and 7 megatons of CO2. So that's about 10% of our entire greenhouse gas emissions profile, you know, CO2 equivalent now. So we do include agriculture in that. We don't include aviation and maritime, which I think is also a critical issue that needs to be faced. And so we had significant reductions due to COVID-19, but as we're spotting now with our traffic counter data, that's rebounding right back up. And so then we need to look at what do we simulate then in terms of our low carbon passenger transport transition. And what you can see here in the dark blue is if we get 840,000 electric vehicles, we can achieve a certain section of that, but it doesn't get us all the way. No. Now and then another half, looking at, again, improving cars, it actually comes from biofuels. And that again comes back to, there are cars currently in our fleet, fossil fuel cars, that won't be phased out immediately because the average age of a car is between 6 and 7 years old. And we have a lot of fossil fuel cars, a lot of very new ones as well, that won't be phased out for the next 10 years because they operate just fine and people still own them and they still spend money on them, right? And so then biofuels are part and parcel of those older cars in the fleet. But then for the rest of it, we're looking at public transport, we're looking at Netherlands scale of modal shift, so real serious uptake of walking and cycling. And then as well, looking at working from home. So that would be 2 days per week working from home for everyone that can possibly work from home. And we got that figure from looking at what are the jobs here in Ireland, what are the duties, and how many of those duties can be conducted from home. So we did factor that into our calculations. And you can see here that it is all of those measures, the full electrification of public transport and the uptake of public transport, the Netherlands scale of modal shift, and also electric vehicles and biofuels and working from home that get us to that target. Okay, so you really do need to have a holistic view of how we're going to manage this passenger transport low carbon transition. So I think that's it from me. I would love to hear your suggestions. I'm looking forward to some questions and really getting into it more. Feel free to reach out to me and contact me on my social medias as well. And yeah, I really hope you enjoyed it and you were able to follow. I've been told I have a very strong Irish accent, so I apologize if anything was tough to follow. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Vera. That was very good. I actually grew up in Southwest Cork, and so I particularly enjoy your accent, Vera. I really, really do.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely.
Okay, I think you're still screen sharing, so maybe drop that off. And while you do, I'll introduce our next speaker. We actually were sort of wrangling with trying to get an additional poll question in sort of last minute, and we weren't able to get it in. So I'm actually going to post the question just in the chat, and maybe we can pause while I do it. Multitask. Okay, post it in the chat. So maybe we can just go back and forth on this as I introduce and as the talk is getting started. So our next speaker is David Pickup. And David Pickup is a consultant with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. He has 7 years of experience planning, analyzing, and executing clean energy initiatives, including quantifying opportunities and designing strategies for Dunsky clients, leading corporate planning with the Public Energy Efficiency Agency, and heading up policy advocacy and analysis for the UK's solar industry. So over to you, David, to take us away.
Great, thank you, everyone. Continuing the European takeover of this first session, as a native Brit, I'm now living in Edmonton, Alberta, so up in the frozen north, although it's not too frozen yet. Great, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about teleworking, and we've already touched on it a little bit. Vera said a couple of things that I'm hoping to pick up on a little bit in my talk. I'll sort of throw those in. Yeah, I just want to say welcome everyone here. Great to have you. Just to very quickly talk about Dunsky, we're a small, about 40 people based consultancy based all across Canada, and we really help our clients understand the opportunities within the clean transition and how to go after those in the best way. And then we work with clients all across North America, lots of governments, lots of utilities. In the building space, renewables, and mobility as well. So for today, I'm going to be talking about teleworking, also known as remote working, also known as working from home, something that I'm sure is very familiar to lots of people here. And there's really going to be a little bit of context, that kind of macro level looking at the world as it fits with telework, talking about a project that we did with the city of Edmonton, and then kind of talking about what the future looks like. So the first point, teleworking massively scaled up during the pandemic. Again, should be fairly obvious to everyone here. And I just wanted to highlight that with this Pew Research Center report from December last year, where 20% of people worked from home all or most of the time. 71% are currently working from home as of about a year ago, and really we see that that desire to work from home lasting in. Apologies if you can hear my dog. Working from home after the outbreak of coronavirus ends. The second piece is that emission reductions from the avoiding commuting associated with telework is fairly significant, and we saw that in a sort of island situation. For Canada, this is some work that was done by Statistics Canada, about 8.6 megatons, so it's about 6% of household emissions. It doesn't seem that significant in terms of the overall economy, but when you kind of consider how basically that was enabled to be enacted with a few weeks notice at the early part of 2020, compared to some of those more broad kind of economy and technological changes, really a good opportunity. And I will just mention, I'm curious, Vera, what the number in Ireland was, but in Canada at least, that was based on some analysis that StatsCan did, showing 40% as the maximum telework capacity. Teleworking comes with a host of benefits and negative consequences. The equity piece is really strong here as well, with those 60% of people that can't work from home. What do those jobs look like? What does that mean in terms of some of the policies that governments are putting in place, or even just the changes in the sort of urban landscape that would happen when you're getting more deliveries locally, and you have more sort of centralized services and less, and also more around the design of neighborhoods and neighborhood level services compared to the sort of downtown and a suburb type model that you see in North America, as well as all those other things. And then in terms of post-COVID, companies and governments are really wrestling with this right now. You can see here from some McKinsey work, 99% of staff pre-pandemic, in an office at work, at a work location, that's really shifting down to only 10%, and the sort of the majority of that balance is made up by people who are there between 20 and 80%. So there's still a role for offices, but what does that look like? And what does that mean for the future of work? As well as some of those benefits and the downsides, how does that kind of play in? in terms of the project that we did, we kind of, with all of that context, really brought it down to a very specific example, which is the city of Edmonton, which is a extremely ambitious climate city. It has a recently updated 1.5 level ambition energy transition strategy. They're aiming to get from about 19 tons per person per year down to about 3 tons per person per year by 2030. So very kind of ambitious goals. And one of their goals is to, or one of their strategies, I should say, is looking at teleworking for the city's staff as one of those opportunities to save emissions. And yeah, so this was funded through a legacy grant of the IPCC. We were obviously working on it as well as RFS Energy Consulting, SATE, and then a couple of those other bodies that you see there. The report is available online, so I can throw a link in the chat after this, so you can go and read it, and I'll sort of highlight a few things from that. So the big question was, how do you calculate the savings from telework? The first thing is really kind of how many employees are we talking about and how do they commute? And then for those commutes, Vera did a great job of kind of showing the different emission intensity. You know, what's the emission intensity of those commute modes? One thing I will say is that the island number of about 120 grams per kilometer, we see about double that in Edmonton, and that's partly because we have the highest light truck ownership in all of Canada, but also just generally, you know, car efficiencies compared to European vehicles. So that gives us the baseline emissions of, you know, all the people that commute, how they commute, and the emissions that result from that. The next piece we look at is the expected policy uptake. So, you know, are people going to be, how many people are going to be taking up the policy? To what extent are they going to be working from home? You know, how many days a week, that kind of thing. And, you know, weaving that in gives us the direct emission reductions. And really what we're talking about here is the commute, the avoided commute that they have. And that's as far as we were able to get with this project. But what's really important to consider is there's all these other rebound indirect effects. I sort of saw a couple in the chat that people were talking about conceptually that can seem like they have a huge impact. And so in order to understand what the net emissions impact, you need to kind of think about those as well. And so I'll talk about those a little bit more in a bit. So we found, as I mentioned, these sort of indirect impacts are really uncertain and complex, particularly over the long term. It's really difficult to ascertain, you know, exactly what the net emissions impact of telework is. But we had a go, and on the direct side, we found that, you know, about 15,000 tons per year is the total commute of all the city employees. The teleworking policy could reduce that by about 10%. So one thing that's worth sort of keeping in context here is the only, at this first kind of, for the first phase of the rollout of the policy, only 13% of employees were eligible. And that was the sort of out of scope, so sort of non-union and management were the two. So again, another kind of equity lens to bring here that, you know, not all employees will have access to this kind of policy, certainly in the short term. So that's at a sort of company-wide level, and then, you know, per person, we're really talking about a 70% reduction in the commute emissions. And just bearing in mind that sort of 19 down to 3 number, the saving of about a ton per year it does get you some other way. It's obviously not all of the emissions associated with a particular household, but it's, you know, something that can help reduce those emissions. One last thing I wanted to highlight is around the indirect impacts. This isn't work that we did, but actually work out of France, where they really tried to quantify, or at least, you know, conceptualize and then give a sense of scale what some of these indirect impacts would look like. I'm not going to have time to kind of run through all of them, so I'll just kind of speak at a high level. But essentially, what we're looking at here is the commute reduction, that avoided commute being, you know, 100% on the right. That's, you know, the percentage of the commute emissions. And then the first level of short-term effects are things like a decreased use of office energy use for commercial buildings. Can be around the same scale as actually the commute reduction. New daily mobility has kind of been mentioned a couple of times in the chat, I think, where people who were able to do things on their commutes, like going grocery shopping, now have to go on an extra trip, and some of those things. House energy use as well, another kind of negative impact. A couple of other pieces. Relocation being a potentially big one that can impact that kind of urban planning and design. And then longer term, no numbers really associated with these, but lots and lots of different impacts that don't necessarily, or many are kind of rebound effects, so they impact the GHG emissions in a negative way. Just in terms of a couple of things to look at in the future, understanding those indirect impacts is really important. As I mentioned, kind of each of those 4 things. We are actually working with the City of Toronto now to understand their office energy use. And we're doing more work in the future in each of these. There's some great work happening in Carleton, in Ottawa, looking at some of the home energy use and metering. And then I really want to make sure that we have this GHG lens, and obviously with COP happening, the GHG reductions are super important, but all of the other things that have been mentioned today are important too: the social impacts, the economic impacts, equity, and just sort of broader urban planning. And then finally, the sort of geographic impact. Things can vary a lot depending on city design, how people travel in that city, and just what it looks like. So, and that's it from me. I will stop sharing my screen, and yeah, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, David. Absolutely fascinating. I would really be interested in that analysis done on our local city as well, to see if some of the mobility distances change much of what's playing out there. But thank you very much. So we have one speaker left, and while we go through this one, please do think about questions for the Q&A. You can start posting them in the chat and or save them for the end. So our next speaker is Dr. Anik Javid, who is a researcher in the working group for land use, infrastructure and transport at Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin, Germany. He works at the intersection of behavioral, institutional, and environmental economics. His work is concentrated on 2 broad issues: the role of behavioral science in transition to low carbon transportation in cities, and demand-side solutions to climate change mitigation. Thank you very much, Anik, and do take us away.
Thanks a lot. I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Anik Javid, and I'm working at Mercator Institute for Climate Change. What I'm going to present is a systematic meta-review of reducing transport emissions by targeting individual level behavior. So just to start with the motivation, there are many reasons for moving away from cars. And I think so this is one thing that, especially when you're working in Climate Change Institute, you have to kind of remind people a little bit that foremost, there's the health reason for moving away from cars. So the city where I come from, it's Lahore in Pakistan. The visibility in this season drops to about 10 feet. It's one of the most polluted cities in the world at the moment. And I think so you can see the picture on the red. It's basically you cannot see after that distance. So the health and basically like there's a joke in urban economics that each day you get a new study which tells you how bad smoke and pollution is for a different metrics. So health costs in many estimates are actually even more than climate change costs. So one of the main reasons that we want to move away from car is health. Then we also have the climate change issues, and obviously we also have congestion and economic costs of having car dependency in the cities. So going back a little bit to the transport-related emissions, I think so 3 things are very clear. First is that transport sector hasn't seen any decline globally, but I mean we have better data on EU level, and there you can see that there is just no decline compared to other sectors where there have been some gradual progress. Second, that road transport is one of the most important component of the transport emissions. And I think so. The third thing which I would want to emphasize is that EU, where generally you have seen more reductions. You look at the policies that have been announced, and you can see that the current policies are at nowhere close to getting to any of the targets that have been announced. So this has led to a lot of different debates about what kind of transport-related policies can be introduced. And one of the policy measures that has been gaining momentum in a way in the last 20 years is what is called soft or behavioral intervention. So you can see the definition of the soft or behavioral intervention. Basically, it's about voluntarily changing travel behavior rather than through coercive measures or through infrastructure measures. The appeal for these measures is that they are relatively cheap. They can be implemented in a short time period, and often they are more convenient for policymakers. A transport infrastructure project takes roughly 2 years at the very least, if it is a very uncomplicated intervention. And if you have a more systematic intervention, that takes about 10 years. Whereas voluntary behavior interventions can be rolled out in 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes within months, and could be carried on. And the priceless and the voluntary part is, I think, so one of the most important factor also, because there has been a general resistance to rely on pricing measures to curb the transport emissions. And I think so this can be seen very much with the vehicle mile travel tax that was at some point hinted in US, but had to be quickly sort of like poo-pooed that this is not what we are going to do. So the question is whether these soft interventions work, what is the evidence for them, and to what extent we can say in what way they work. If you're not familiar with them, I have like some of the examples of typical soft interventions. Typically, they are like work travel plans or school travel plans, sometimes targeting particular individuals. So what I did was with a team, we went through 2 different rounds of systematic reviews of existing studies. And the first round was where we took out reviews. So there have already been reviews on soft interventions. Most of these reviews are what are called narrative reviews. So they are reviews which basically do not systematically look at the evidence, but rather provide it in terms of from the perspective of a practitioner or from a researcher, or they present the result in a more narrative way. What we are trying to do is to have a more systematic approach to it. So we go through all the studies that have been basically, first we narrow down the reviews which are relevant to our criteria. So we have basically 30 reviews. And from those 30 reviews, we go through each study that they have mentioned and go to the original source to try to find information on that. So in this way, we are basically targeting about 300 studies. We expect 300 original studies. These are both academic literature as well as government reports and grey literature of many other different kinds. So this is one first search, and then we do a second search. And the second search is about looking at original studies. And here we focus on studies which have been published or which have been uploaded after 2015. And the rationale for choosing that data is that the most complete review that we could found was basically in 2015. So it included studies only until then. And based on this search and systematically eliminating studies, we basically end up with around 57 to be exact studies. Combining these 2 searches, we have roughly 700 different estimates of different transport behavioral outcomes. related to soft intervention policies. About 90% of them are from cities in high-income countries, so it's a very geographically unbalanced. In a way, we don't have a lot of evidence from low-income or middle-income even countries. In Asia, basically, we have only evidence from China and Japan. And also, in terms of like cities in particular, they are mostly related to bigger cities rather than smaller cities. In lieu of time, I'm just going to go into results. And we look at 3 different types of results. So first, I'm going to present you what is called the growth of mode use. And we're going to look in terms of car use, in terms of public transport, in terms of biking and walking. So for each one of them, I'm just going to present the mean value, sort of corrected for sample bias, whether it's a small sample or a big sample. The key message here is that what basically you can see is that that public transport and biking, so the studies generally report very large numbers for them. So one critical point for this would be that here I'm not plotting it against the actual mode share of the city where or the area where it was implemented. So when you look at that, you basically realize that most of the studies which report a very high growth rate are basically studies where the initial mode share is very low. So typically, if the mode share is less than 5%, for instance, for biking, then the studies which are conducted in that kind of area or a site, they would just report very big numbers. And there are basically 2 different types of reasons for that. One is just the mathematical, that once you are at a lower level, the growth is much higher, even if the actual absolute growth is very small. And the second is that it could be possible that cities which are very low biking cities are ripe for these kind of interventions. So you have a low-hanging fruit that you can pick up in those cities. So in terms of average growth number, what we find is that public transport and biking has a large increase. The second type of outcome that we are going to look at is what is called the mode choose or mode shift, mode share, so shifted mode share. And again, I'm going to just present the averages across different studies. I'm going to separate them out on the estimates which are based on area-wide. So this include at least the aggregate or the sample from the whole area rather than just from a small site. And the second one should be site and not side. There's a typo in there. So site specific is something like a private firm or a university implementing a travel plan in their site. So then if a study is conducted and it only looks at the outcomes for this particular site, but does not take into account the whole traffic patterns in that area. So these are the site-specific estimates. And again, we would expect that site-specific estimates would be higher than the area-wide estimates. The key message here is that basically the mode shift potential is much lower. So you can see, especially for area-wide, the car shift is closer to 1% change. And I really want to emphasize this is the best case scenario. So most of these studies are only looking at very short-term behavioral change. So we are not talking about long-term behavioral change. However, what we can see is that at the site level, the potential for change is much higher. And in terms of promoting alternative transport modes, so public transport and bike share, basically we do not really see any increase in the share of these modes. The only major potential that we see is actually more in walking, and a lot of these studies are quite well conducted. So I think so that those estimates I would be more sure about. So the last component of this is that the soft interventions or behavioral interventions have different kind of emphasis often or different components. Some of them are just purely about giving information. Some of them are about different kinds of promotional activities or promotional programs. Others have a component where you give peer or expert advice and you set goals for individuals. Another typical type of is where you give a free ticket for a certain amount of time, or you give free tickets as moving incentives. So if you move to a new place, you're given incentive for a limited amount of time. And sometimes also soft infrastructure, and this also includes the information and communication technologies, which make some of the mode shift a little bit easier. And basically, in terms of mode shift potential, it's very I would say commonsensical results. That basically, if you give incentives, then public transit has a higher shift, and the cars are lower. And again, these are mostly exclusively based on site-specific estimates and not area-specific. So generally, the impact would be a little bit higher than what we expect. So in short, what is the main take-home message? I think so. Basically, we can say that they are effective in promoting public transport use and biking, behavioral intervention, at least in the short term. They are effective in car use in terms of decreasing its growth, especially when we are considering like site-specific estimates. But they are not very effective in shifting away from car use or changing the travel patterns in aggregate or at the area level. This last point has a big implication for climate mitigation targets, because what it means is that basically behavioral interventions have a greater potential when you are thinking about health goals, because health goals are really about like increasing walking or increasing biking. If I do not consider, for instance, the pollution impact of the cars, because that is a more complicated one. The economic goals generally are related to congestion and or site-specific aspects of transport behavior. So here again, these policies can provide you better results. For transport-related carbon emissions, as has been said by earlier presenters, that what you really need is a shift and a decrease in car use, and also a decrease in the amount of vehicles that are traveled. And in all those cases, the potential is much more limited. However, what you can think of is you can link it to different transition theories. You can say, okay, these policies can be used to provide a critical mass of bicycle users, which can then lock in the gains from these. So if you link to transition theories, maybe they have a bigger role. And also there is an argument that they can be combined with more hard infrastructure changes, and then their potential is slightly higher. I would like to end with pointing out that the qualities of studies in general, or the evidence, not studies actually, but of the evidence itself, I would say is not very high. So it's very difficult to find studies which look at area-wide estimates, which is exactly what you need for GHG emissions, given the equilibrium effects. So also the measurement issues of how the behavior is measured or how mode shift is measured, and we always have risk of biasness in this kind of meta-analysis. So I would caution against the fact that we need to also increase the quality of studies and find a form of standardization, at least when you're reporting on policy interventions, to find standardization which makes it that these studies can be compared against each other and the outcomes can be compared against each other. So thanks for listening. I hope you have some interesting thoughts, and I would be very much willing to learn and listen to your thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anik. Okay. So that's it from our speakers today. So if all the speakers will be up for taking yourself off camera, or on camera rather. One quick thought is we've been asked to encourage you all to share your contact information with each other, so you can get stuck in sharing emails, LinkedIn profiles, Twitter, etc. So you can follow up with each other and sort of keep the discussion going. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to the floor to see if anyone has any questions for our speakers. If you'd like to ask a question in person, Please do put up your hand and we'll call on you and give you a chance to raise your hand. We probably only have a handful of questions available, but please do get stuck in. Would anyone like to go first?
There are a lot of questions in the chat, so we could just have people answer them maybe.
Yeah, let's go ahead. I'm just going to try and pull one out. Here, let's ask. I think this question was directed at Aneeque, and it was focusing on where data can come from. So it's asking where the data comes from public transport for free, or are there other sources? This might be directed at Aneeque, but also if anyone else would like to chime in, question around what are the best sources for data for this type of work?
So I think I had two different questions on data. I would address the first one, which is about where it comes from. So we actually have a platform in our institute where we go through all different types of what I call databases, where academic or non-academic studies are stored. And we have a machine learning algorithm which basically weeds out the initial studies, and then we go through different studies one by one to figure out whether this study fits our criteria or not. So most of the data is coming from academic and non-academic literature. The second question, there was another one which was about whether we had something about free public transit, free public transport. So free public transport, if it is indefinite, it's not considered a soft policy because that's a hard policy. However, if it is for a short amount of time, so let's say 3 months or whatever, 6 months, or as a promotional event, we have a lot of cities which implemented that. So when we look at the incentives, for instance, that was basically coming from that kind of data. But if the policy is that public transport would be free indefinitely, that's not considered a soft policy.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Would anyone from the floor like to put up their hand and ask a question? If not, hey, Kimberly, I've seen that you've been quite active coming back and forth on questions. Would you like to elaborate on any of these for a quick minute?
I just will say I posted some links where you can find a plan, and I posted a link to our, it looks like they weren't active. I'll post those again. The microsite for the project, which has a lot of tools and summaries of how each meeting or large workshops went. And then a couple of folks asked if our stakeholders were compensated, which is a question we do hear quite often. How do you get folks to participate? And they largely were not. Well, actually, no one was compensated. My guess is that they were mostly motivated to participate because of their personal or professional interests.
Wonderful. Okay, we are about at time. If anyone has a question, I think there's time for one more. Give you a quick opportunity. If not, then I think why don't we say thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you all for coming. We are right on time.